Hello, everyone. Hello. Give a couple seconds, let people join in before we get started. All righty. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Happy Thursday, your pre-Friday to your Friday. My name's Hayden, and I have the honor and privilege to be your moderator today. I'm excited to see how today's topics will assist you and your team in taking not just your SharePoint environment, but your business to the next level. A few things to mention before we jump in. I'm sure you may have noticed that when you all joined, your mics are muted. If you do have any questions or comments during the presentation, we do encourage you to utilize the QA feature up in your toolbar. That'll allow our team to be able to reply to you during the webinar. Once the webinar concludes, we will then be moving into a live Q&A session, which we will then allow users to unmute, ask any questions to our team in real time, not just about what we covered in today's webinar, but pretty much any of your 365 environment questions. So we'll go more over that in detail later. Also, the next webinar will be held August 7th, so go ahead and mark your calendars because we'll have even more topics to cover then. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andrea to give you guys a brief message. Over to you, Andrea.
Hey, thank you, Hayden. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our SharePoint Concierge clients, our support clients, and guests. We do these webinars about 10 a year, and so we're just really happy that you made it today. We do these really for a few things. We want to introduce some new features that are being released, that are upcoming or have just been released in Microsoft 365, an ever-changing environment. And then we also like to highlight possibly some underutilized features. And so this is really some think tank, some exploration, and some, giving you some use cases and ideas for growing your organization in the Microsoft 365 stack. So once again, welcome, and back over to you, Hayden.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. As you may notice, looking at the screen, we do have a smaller agenda today than we typically do, but that's just so that we can dive a little bit deeper into the topics we're discussing. To go over those topics really quick, Ken will be starting us off with the data loss prevention via Entra method. This presentation will show you how your organization can prevent users from downloading or syncing sensitive information in real time without unnecessary interruptions. Whether you're managing grants or safeguarding health or personal records, conditional access ensures that only the right individuals under the right circumstances can access the right information. After that, Katie will catch us up to speed about the brand new SharePoint dashboard web part. If you haven't seen it on your tenant, this is going to be super exciting. In this section, you will discover how to create visually compelling and interactive dashboards using the all-new dashboard web part, now available across all sites. Whether you'll use Microsoft's ready-made cards that they have pre-designed or design your own custom ones, you'll learn how to craft dashboards that truly cultivate and inform. So, with all that said, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on into our first topic of the day, data loss prevention via Microsoft Entra, taught by Ken. Over to you, Ken.
Hey, thanks, Hayden. So compliance is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I happen to think that making sure that your data is protected is something that you should think about probably every single day. So if you're an administrator of your tenant, one of the things that you should be getting used to is going in and monitoring the various administrative dashboards that are available to you to see how the data is flowing around your organization. Compliance is actually one of the more complicated topics, and so we're going to talk about one specific area today in depth, and then we'll touch very lightly on an additional method for accomplishing the task that we're looking at today, which is how can we easily block downloading of content. But we could easily take a full day, if not a full week, and get into endpoint management, edge management. We could get into the Microsoft Defender Online tool suite, Entra, and then obviously Purview in the Compliance Center. So please feel free to reach out to dataBridge if you'd like to continue these conversations. We welcome having a chance to work with you and help you reach your compliance needs. So as we mentioned today, what we'll be looking at is how to accomplish blocking downloads using the identity and access management features inside of Entra. Normally, we would come in through Purview, we would use the Compliance Center, and we would create sensitivity labels, or we would use the data loss prevention features in Purview, and that would be the traditional method for managing most of these kinds of tasks. But Entra provides a similar mechanism that might be a little easier for you to get your head around. And the reason that we would use Entra is if we're looking at a group of people, a population, as opposed to the content itself, Entra might be a more natural place to begin the conversation. If you're thinking about the content, either the containers the content is going to live in or the documents themselves, then we would look at Purview. We would look at things like sensitivity labels or DLP. But when you're thinking about your users and you're thinking, I have a set of stakeholders who are external to my organization, but whom I collaborate with, but I want them to just come in and look at content. I don't want them downloading that content. How could I manage that without turning on sensitivity or doing the other actions that are inside of the Purview administrative area? And Entra does provide a mechanism for doing this. Now, these are all more licensed features. So depending on exactly how you're licensed, you may or may not be able to roll out one of these solutions that we're going to discuss today. Obviously, if you're E3 or E5, you have very broad licensing, but the further down in the stack you go from a licensing perspective, the more restrictive you get. You effectively really only get monitoring capability, and even that is very minimal when you're in the lower tier of the licensing structure. So some of the terms that you'll hear today are signal. A signal is the thing that we're monitoring for. So we're looking for things like you belong to a particular group. You are accessing the system from a particular type of device, usually an unmanaged device. You're logging in via a tablet or a phone that I don't know about. Or you could be looking in a particular application space. Then you have the decision that's going to be made. So we're looking to see, what should I do if the person is trying to take a particular action, belongs to a particular group, or is trying to take a particular action from a particular device? And then you have the enforcement mechanisms, which again, those are things that you should be engaged with daily, where you're going out and you're just monitoring what's happening. Those are your dashboards to see what's going on with your policies and your labels that you have deployed across your enterprise. So we're going to go ahead and do a screen share here and take a look at our administrative area. The administrative area has lots of sub consoles. So this is the M365 Admin Center. And we're going to bring up Entra. And so in Entra itself, we have lots of things we can do. I'm sure most of your administrative staff are in here constantly, because here's where we do our user management. But we also have a protection area. And this protection area is where we can spend our time today. So one of the things we can do in protection is we can work with conditional access. Conditional access is where we would do DLP-like features. So you'll notice as soon as I access the conditional access area, I begin to get my dashboard views. So here's where I can start to see what kind of policies I have deployed. You can see I have a policy enabled. That's our MFA policy. I also have a report only policy enabled, where I'm monitoring what would happen if I were to deploy this policy. That's what report only gives us, is the ability to see the impact of a policy before we push it out. And I can change my view based on our tabs here, so that then I can see what's going on in terms of the, the flow of data connected to the Entra policies. But what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how would I put a new policy online specifically to block downloading access for a given group of users. So here I would create my new policy. I then would give the policy a name. So I could say block external access guests downloads. I then have to decide who in my population of users am I going to target this policy to? So here's where we would recommend using a group-based approach. The all users, obviously, for our particular use case, wouldn't be applicable, but you could go after all users if you were doing something like MFA, for example. Here you would select your users and groups, and then you can decide who you want to target this to. And so you can see guests and external users is a constituency that's already thought out, and so you can choose that. That gives you the ability then to register your stakeholders so that they have an AD presence, so you know who they are, and then you can manage their access. This obviously wouldn't work for the anonymous type access. Next, we would look at our target resources. So one of the things you have to decide when you're creating your policies, in addition to the scope of the users who are going to be targeted by the policy, is what areas of the M365 universe are going to be targeted. M365 is a very big machine. It has a lot of moving parts. And so targeting the right area is an absolute critical step. So if we go look at our target resources, we can then choose to do selected resources. Then we can come in and select our resources. And here's where we would begin to go in and see what is available to us. So as you start to scroll through this list, you can see there is a ton of places that you could target. So you can go after a specific application. You can see, for example, we have Adobe Acrobat, right, as a singular application that we could target. We could target other specific applications. But in our use case, what we're looking at is the Microsoft Office applications. That's what we're most worried about. And so we can do a search for 365. Hopefully it'll come back. We'll do a more targeted search. We'll do Office 365. There we go. So here we have the Office 365 suite, and that's going to cover all of our standard Office files. So we're going to be able to cover Excel, PowerPoint, Word, Visio, and so on. So with one selection, you have the ability then to say, okay, that's who I'm going to target. I can then make the decision, what do I want to do? I know who I'm looking at. I know what I'm looking at. And now what I need to do is to say, what actions do I care about? What am I trying to prevent? And here's where I can go down into under access controls. Microsoft uses a slightly obscure language here. You have grant, which makes sense, right? You could grant access, but here you have what's called session, and that's actually what we're going to use. And so we can choose our session controls. Here we get to pick what is it that I'm looking to choose. I'm looking for conditional access application controls. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And then here I can choose which policy I want to deploy. You'll see here we have block downloads as an available policy that I can say, yep, I'm going to go ahead and prevent people from downloading. That'll make it so that those external users can look at things via the web client, but they can't actually pull it down onto their desktop into their local client. The preview that you see next to that should be a warning to everyone on the call. We normally don't recommend using preview functions in production, and that's because Microsoft reserves the right to either eliminate them outright or to change them at any time. So you do have to know that using the preview through this mechanism, you're kind of doing that at your own risk, because if you deploy this policy in production, they could change it the very next day, right? They could decouple this feature and then it just stops working, or they could change it so you're beginning to have unanticipated results. So if you wanted to do other actions, you would use a custom policy. The custom policy then would need to be built out. That would be something like blocking printing or blocking some other action that they wanted the user to take. In our case, we would just do block downloads and click select. At this point, the system shouldn't allow you to do anything with the policy because the policy is malformed, because you can see I still have an error right here, but it does take you here to what do I want to do in terms of turning this policy on? And that's because this interface, as you can tell, just by looking at it, has not been modernized. So when we take a look at Purview here in just a few minutes, and we look at a similar action in the data loss prevention area of Purview, you'll see that Purview's been almost thoroughly modernized. There's a few areas where it's still lagging a little bit. They're still tweaking things behind the scenes, but the new compliance center, it's much easier to use. It's much more guided in terms of the actions that you would take to put a label online or to put a policy online. You don't get that here. Here, Microsoft's expecting that, you've got folks who have been trained formally in Entra, and so they know what they're looking at. So in terms of enabling the policy, and this is generally true across all of the policy entry points. So the policies all run across the tenants, that there are multiple entry points. So you can publish policies in any of the areas that I mentioned initially on the call. So you can publish things out of Microsoft Defender. You can publish things out of Entra, as we're doing here. We could do things out of Purview. So policies can be created in a lot of points. They all have the concept of, I'd like to run the policy in a mode that is essentially a trial. I'm looking to see what the impact of that policy might be, so that as users conduct their activities, they're tripping the policy, they're triggering it by having a policy violation. And I can monitor for that safely to see, am I getting too many people who are triggering this, or not enough people who are triggering this, or I'm getting an unanticipated result from the trigger. So running in report only is absolutely something we recommend. In fact, I personally recommend that you run in report only for quite a bit of time. I recommend that you run for several weeks at a minimum. And if you can afford to do it from a time perspective, a month or two is ideal. And the reason for that is that if you cast a little too broad of a net, if you, for example, were doing your external guest downloads and you said, yeah, I'm going to block all my guests, but for some reason there was a set of guests account who were special, and they, even though they were still guests, were not meant to be treated as true guests. They were meant to be treated almost as people who are on staff with you. You might have a series of consulting groups, for example, who work very closely with you and manage day-to-day activities, and now you've prevented them from working on a file. So that would be a case where if you have a long enough trial period, one of those people might, trip the policy. And so then by monitoring the policy and seeing what's happening as the policy ebbs and flows throughout the days, you could then catch the fact that, oh, that's right, I have a particular constituency group. And then you could, decide to either reduce who you're going to work with, or you would go meet with those people and explain, we're going to roll out this policy. Here's the effect it would have on your day-to-day work operations. In other policy areas, one of the big things that we see is that if you use service accounts and you cast a broad net where you basically say, yeah, anyone who's registered, right? Any employee who's registered with my with my tenant, and then you don't exclude the service accounts, you might have a situation in the case here where we have download blocked, where the service account is actually trying to work with files in a download mode because it's trying to go and grab a data file from a given location, download it, parse the file, and then take that data and upload it to another location using some sort of data transform mechanism. In the case of rolling out the policy, you could immediately have an issue where it's going to get blocked from doing that data download, and so now it can't complete the rest of its tasks. And it's actually a real incident that a client had because they cast a huge net in terms of who is going to get caught up in one of their policies. They actually just turned on you must identify using the sensitivity labels every document that you create. The problem is that one of their agents, one of their service accounts, was doing document creation in the background. It didn't know it needed to label anything with a sensitivity label. No default sensitivity label was applied for that data container that it was working with. And so it was getting stuck because it essentially couldn't save the document because setting the sensitivity label was required. Again, running in report only mode prevents you from running into those operational issues. So we absolutely recommend, if you can afford it from a time perspective, please do run these for several weeks. Again, I recommend a month or two if you can afford the time. Once you're done with the report, you can then choose to turn the policy on if it's running to your expectations. So that'll give you the ability then to deploy it out. They do not deploy instantaneously. Like all things Microsoft, it can take several hours. In fact, it can take, in some cases, up to a full week. There are interfaces that will tell you it can take a week to deploy a particular type of policy. It depends on how complex the policy is and how many areas it's touching. So don't be shocked if you turn something on and it takes a full day at least before you start to see the impact of it in a given location. Once you're done, you hit create, and then that will actually push the policy out in whatever mode you've chosen to push the policy out on. You'll notice that you've got here for policies that are running in report only mode, it's giving you a warning down here, and that's because the amount of interaction that Microsoft does with non-Windows platforms is much reduced from what it does on the Windows platform, obviously. And so here you're basically saying, should I go ahead and continue to include things that are Mac OS or iOS or Android or Linux, or should I exclude them from being monitored by this policy? And that's to prevent, in theory, potentially a ton of false positives. Because if you are interacting with the other platforms, you could get a bad user experience, because even though it's running in a test or observation mode, the user is going to perceive that this policy is on. And we're trying to make sure the user doesn't feel any impact when we're running it in report only. Right? We want to see that the user did some action, the policy would have caught that action, and it would have taken the appropriate steps to block whatever it was that we were trying to block, or to grant what we're trying to grant. In the case of these lesser supported platforms, it is possible that you would wind up with a situation where the user would get a warning of some kind, and that's not necessarily the user experience that you're looking for. So you do have to be careful when you're working with particularly the Mac OS. That's where I see it a lot, is you've got a lot of clients that have Mac OS for their design staff or their visual graphics staff, and they wind up getting weird error messages because Microsoft simply doesn't support that OS as well as it does Windows. All right, so those are the steps that you would take here. Again, I want to go over the dashboard once you have the policy running. If you are coming to protection and you go into conditional access, you will get the dashboard that will tell you what's happening. So we'll go ahead and go back to the dashboard here. On the dashboard, it will show you here from a policy snapshot, what policies you have running and how they're running. It shows you the users that are signed in. And so you have the ability to look at what's happening. And so you can switch to monitoring. Here it gives you graphical representation of what's happening with the policies and the interaction across time. It does take a while to render, as you can see, so do be patient. But you have the ability to see what's happening with that policy. So again, if you're running the policy in preview mode, then the dashboard here is where you would come to see what's happening with the interaction with that policy. The same effect in terms of monitoring and blocking certain actions like download can be achieved using a couple of techniques, and we're going to look at one of them in the data loss prevention area inside of Purview. So Purview is one of our other administrative consoles. Microsoft is thinking about branding all the time, and so you will see this co-branded as the Compliance Center and Microsoft Purview. So the Microsoft Purview is the larger container, is how I think about it, and Compliance Center is the functional view that lives kind of within the concept of Purview. But we can come to our solutions here on Purview, and one of our solutions that we have is the data loss prevention area. So data loss prevention, we're now in that console area. You can see that from a user interface perspective, again, if we compare and contrast it with this, right, this has obviously been modernized. Simple things like the fonts are larger. It's just easier to read. It's easier to find things. So this is a more modernized interface. They began rolling out the new Compliance Center a few months back, and it has really made working with this tool much easier than it has been in the past. So just like we did inside of Entra, we would have the idea of doing a policy, and we can make the choice then here to come in and say, let me look at my policies I have deployed. I can then create a new policy. You will see I have a guided structure here. It's not like the other interface where I basically have these sections that are collapsed. Here I have a wizard that's taking me through each of these areas. I can jump to any area I want to simply by clicking on it. So if I'm editing a policy that already exists, I can go right to the section I want to edit, or I can step through what's happening. And on the screen, it gives you clear guidance on what's happening in that area. So here, for example, it says, what type of data do I want to protect? So again, if we think about the Entra view of the world, when I'm coming in through this interface, I'm really looking at it more through the lens of who, right? Who am I interacting with? Because it's a conditional access approach. Here I'm looking at more of a what. What am I protecting? That's why the very first thing they ask you in Entra is who. Here they're asking you what. What is it that I'm protecting from? And so here I can choose what it is that I'm going to go ahead and and protect from. And so you can do different kinds of protection, right? So you could do, data inside of the browser itself or data that's stored in SharePoint. And so then we do next. Here you're choosing what type of policy. There are pre-built policies that are designed for certain industries. You can see medical and health and financial are called out here, but I can choose custom, which is what we would normally do. I would then do a custom policy as opposed to medical and health, where I would then choose what regulation I'm trying to comply with. Here, I'm going to go ahead and build an internal, right? I'm not responding to an external GDPR or like regulation. I'm doing something that's going to help us comply with our internal policies and procedures. So I would do a custom policy, and then give it a name. I give it a description. Make sure that there's no collision. You cannot rename, so naming is critical. You can change a lot of things about the policy, but if you, for some reason, have the name incorrect, you normally have to provision a new policy and decommission the original policy. You then get asked about administrative units. An administrative unit is a way to break down your organization into smaller chunks. If you are a very large company, you might have geographies. So you might have Americas and EMEA, Asia Pacific, and so on. Those could be an administrative unit that gets set up, and then you can delegate to individuals management of that administrative unit. Most mid-sized to smaller companies don't do administrative units. They just work with their Active Directory as a consistent whole. So we normally just do the full directory option here. We then have, what do I want to go after? And you can see here I have very targeted, where I can say I'm going to look at my Exchange, my SharePoints, my OneDrives, and so on. The gotcha with this screen is this is an absolutely mission critical screen, because whatever you choose on this screen will limit the scope of what you can do in the follow-on screens. If I were to leave all of these selected, I would have very little that I could actually do in the following screens. And that's because I'm targeting so many things simultaneously that it's just going to say, no, I can't take that action on all of those locations simultaneously. So you want to do as few policies as you possibly can, but you might need to do 2 or 3 policies to really achieve your goals. And so you might want to, in this case here, uncheck these and say, I'm going to go after my SharePoints, my OneDrives, and my Exchange, because that's the core that I'm really concerned about. When I do that, then I can come in and I can actually go ahead and define my policy. Here, I then get a ton of additional features that are available. Again, if I leave everything checked off, I won't have that. So if I click next here, the rules area that I get here would be much more feature rich, because I only selected the 3 areas. If you only select one area, it's as powerful as it can get, because you're basically able to do everything you can do on that one area, because the policy is not trying to apply itself across multiple target destinations. And coming back then to here, you don't have to act on all groups, all sites, or all users and groups. You can edit the actions here, and you can go after a very targeted set of SharePoint sites or a very targeted set of groups, so that you don't, again, over include those service accounts or over include the senior executives in your company or something like that, where they are meant to be excluded from a given policy because they're meant to have ownership level rights on certain objects. Let's take a look at the rules themselves just to show this area. This is the most complex screen of all of the screens. It is, thankfully, for the most part, the last screen. The policy mode screen is the same as it is on the other, where you choose to run in test mode or you can choose to actually deploy the policy. Here's where you would build your rule, and here's where you would set up your conditions. So what it is that you're looking for, you can then take a specific action, and then you notice I have a ton of notification here where I can notify the user that they are in violation of a policy. I can allow them to override. An example of that is attaching something tagged with a sensitivity label. So you have something that says contains PHI. They attach it to an email that violates the policy. It prompts the user, lets them know that that is not allowed, but it allows them to override that action on a singular email because they can say, yeah, but I know who I'm sending this to. I trust who I'm sending this to, and I know it's encrypted point to point and in transit, and so I'm going to go ahead and send it. Then you also have the incident reporting, which is the administrative staff. They get logs letting them know either via email or in the logging system that the violation occurred. And so you have a very rich reporting interface here to watch that these actions are happening, right? That these policy violations are occurring. And then the last screen again is the policy mode screen, and that's where you choose, do I run the policy in test mode or do I run the policy outright? I can also disable the policy from that screen. So that's it for our policies that are going to help you hopefully either using Entra or beginning to work with the DLP system inside of Purview. Block downloads for your documents. Again, if you have any questions or you'd like dataBridge's assistance in working in this area, we'd love to work with you. So please reach out. And with that, I will hand things back to Hayden.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. Prevention is the best type of security, right? So setting up these policies sooner rather than later will benefit you and your company before a problem even exists. I will say though, however, sometimes it might be easier to just be more restrictive up front. When it comes to policies, it's kind of walking a tightrope between safety while not impacting or hindering business operations. But the good news is, as Ken went over, these policies can be pretty complex to meet your various needs throughout your organization. We hope that you continue to learn more and more about them. If you do need help, feel free to reach out to us and we can walk you through various policy options or even help you get some of these set up for you. All right. Thank you so much again, Ken. On to our next segment, which is taught by Katie. She is going to be going over the brand new SharePoint dashboard web part. Very excited for this. Over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Hayden. So yeah, as Hayden mentioned, this is a new feature for SharePoint. This actually, a version of this dashboard was previously available, but you were only allowed one for the whole organization. So what's new about this dashboard is that now you could have a dashboard for each individual department site. So it is still in the process of being rolled out. So there are still some, of course, in Microsoft fashion, a little bit of bugs during the testing. So before we jump into a live demo, I'm just going to show you some examples that Microsoft put out with that you could do with these dashboards using some custom cards that you could add here. So let me pull up a site and we could take a look at how this works. So here I am just on a normal team site. So it's exciting that this is available for all communication and team sites. And again, you could have one for each individual site. So to get the dashboard set up, you're first going to go over to the settings button, which is the little gear. And you'll see this new option that's called Manage Dashboard. So if you click that, if you've never created this dashboard before, you'll see this little create button. If you have created one, you would still be able to get to the dashboard. This would just say edit instead of create. So we're going to create one on the site for the first time by hitting that button. So this automatically takes us to the dashboard designer. So you could look at the URL up here, it does create a page /dashboard.aspx. And this is just going to be a typical page that you'll be able to find in your site pages library as well. So the first thing you'll see here is the ability to say add a card. So you're able to click on this and you'll see all these card options pop up. Now these are different from web parts, even though it does look a lot like the web parts you've always been able to add to SharePoint. These are distinctive because they're cards, so they're adaptive cards or card extensions. So you'll see that SharePoint does give you a handful of ones that you could start out with. They also allow you to add third-party cards down here. So one thing to kind of note with these third-party ones is that they do potentially have a cost associated with them. But you're able to click this link and see all the different options that you can add from third parties from the SharePoint store here. So a lot of options that you can add on from what they already have. But looking at what we have available just out of the box, there's some really neat ones. So for example, we could add an events card here. So if we choose that, you'll be able to open the settings by clicking the little pencil, similar to how web parts work there. So you're able to change the title of what this card says. So maybe you want to call this Our Events. You could choose the size of the card that is going to display. So there's medium and large. And then a lot like the events web part, you could choose where the source is coming from. So for this example, we're just going to say events list on this site, and we're choosing the events list. And we're going to say we want to show all the categories. And so you could also limit how many you're going to show on this card as well. Another really cool feature that's available on a lot of these cards is the ability to audience target here. So you're actually able to add, for example, multiple different cards of the same card. So I could have multiple events, but then target specific audiences. So maybe you want to show an events card for a certain office and a different events card for another office. You could do that all on the same dashboard. So let's add some more cards here. Another nice one is this My Sites. So you might have noticed on the new SharePoint start page, they've gotten rid of the ability to see all the sites that you frequently visited. So this adds a nice way that you could find all your favorited sites that you've been to. Another really nice card is this folder option. So this is going to allow you to pull from different sites. So not only the site that this dashboard's created on, but pull different document libraries. So for example, we could say that we want to pull it from a certain site here and that we're going to want to pull the documents folder. So you could change the icon that's shown here. And again, the title that is showing. And so you can, again, add multiple versions of these. So if I wanted to add another one, maybe from a different site, I could also change what folder it's going to be pulling from if that site has multiple libraries on it. So I could go ahead and hit this change button. And I could choose that I want to use that templates library. And then I could even dive in deeper and say, I want this specific handlebars folder within that library. So another really neat card that you could add here is this card designer. So this is where you could actually create your own custom card. So just from out of the box here, it's going to give you a couple of different templates types that you could do. So heading, image, description, and then you could add in a certain link that you want for that card action. specific image as well, but you could actually take this a step farther and create your own adaptive card. So if I move this to large over here, I'll see this next button pop up. So this gives you an ability to create, using the adaptive card templating, your own custom card here. And it does give you a link to go to the adaptive card designer. So you really don't need to be a developer in order to do this. I have this designer pulled up over on this tab here. So what's really neat about this is that it gives you some really great starting points. And so you could see, all these different options of cards that you could add to your dashboard with just a little bit of, templating. So with any of these cards as well, you have your edit button there. You can move them around where you want them to go. Or, you could delete it if you don't want that card there anymore. So you'll see that there are some cards here that do have some crossover with the web parts that you've seen on your page. For example, like the quick links. The folder is a lot like a document library option. There's just going to be different ways to display these things. You might also be noticing some apps that you use within Teams. So for example, like the approvals or assigned tasks, these might be apps that you're already using in Teams. So this is a great way to kind of draw in Teams and Viva connections within SharePoint to kind of bring them all together. There's a people card as well here. That's really neat feature that you're able to easily find people just by entering a name there. So unlike the web part for people where you do have to add in everyone you want to show, this one allows people to kind of go in and find the people that they're really looking for. Once you have the cards that you think you want, you do have this option to preview how it's going to look. So you could see that if we click this folders, it's going to show us all the different documents that are in there. And it also gives us the ability to either open up that specific document, or you could open up the library itself, and it will bring you right to there. So after you've previewed it, you could close that preview. And once you're happy with what you have, you could go ahead and publish this. So like I said, this is a page, so you are able to come to this page directly to have a full view of just a dashboard. But a really nice feature of this is that they created a companion web part that you could put on any page. So let's go back over to the home page. And let's add that dashboard on here. So we'll go ahead, put the page into edit. Taking a second today. All right. So once this page finally loads, Maybe we'll give it a little refresh, try to help it out a little bit. Struggling a bit today. All right. So you could choose where you, oh my gosh, choose where on the page that you want it to go. And so there is, it's not really wanting me to demonstrate this right now, unfortunately, but there is a new web part that you could add. So just like you would add any other web part, you could go over to the toolbox and start typing in dashboard, and it would pop up, so you could add it. So let's see if it's really not wanting to work for me right now, unfortunately. But you can kind of see back here, if you come over to this toolbox, select see all web parts, it would be available there. And you would be able to add this new dashboard to any of the pages. You could only have one instance of a dashboard per site, but you could add that dashboard web part to as many pages in that site that you want. So unfortunately, it's not gonna really want me to show you how that looks, but luckily, we do have, come back over to our slide. We can see how this does look once it is added to the page. So you're able to choose how many cards that you do want to show up on the page. And you just have this really neat looking dashboard that's going to be a really convenient way to get to different apps that you have displayed in the cards. So that's my quick little demo of this new dashboard web feature for SharePoint. With that, I am going to pass it back over to you, Hayden.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. It wouldn't be a technical webinar with a little technical difficulty, so it's all good. In the past, for this dashboard, we usually had to use maybe a search web part of some sort to pull in information. So it's nice that Microsoft added more of an easier end user approach that it looks good without needing some JSON or some custom code. It also takes away some technical debt for your IT team, which I know IT teams love when that goes away. Also, there are additional audience targeting capabilities within the feature too that may not be available for those web parts alone. And so all in all, I believe this is an amazing new feature, and I look forward to see how it's more utilized in the future and maybe even more updates to it as it continues to roll out. So thank you again, Katie. Thank you, Ken, for today's presentation. That does conclude the learning portion of today's webinar. I hope we've been able to spark some new interest for functionality that you and your teams can explore. Please be on the lookout in your email for our next webinar, which will be held on August 7th. We'll take a look at, we look forward to learning with you again with even more features and functionalities. Before we segue into the live Q&A section really quick, I do want to remind everyone that all the webinar notes, slides, and recordings will be on our learning portal for easy access to everything discussed today for our SharePoint support clients. If for some reason you don't have access to this or you'd like to gain access to this, please reach out to us after the webinar and we'll make sure you're taken care of. Our learning portal is where you and your team will get all the materials, not from just today's webinar, but any future webinar recordings and materials as well. All right, we will now segue into the open live Q&A forum. If you don't plan on staying for the live Q&A, I just want to say thank you again so much for learning with us today. On the screen, we are showing instructions on how to raise your hand to be able to ask a question to one of our presenters. Your mics will be unmuted and questions will be taken in order of hand raise. As a quick friendly reminder, as that's happening, For this live Q&A, we are encouraging users to ask any question they have about SharePoint or 365 environment, and no question is too small. So feel free to raise your hand. We're here to help any way we can. Give a couple minutes letting someone raise their hand if they'd like. I will also say if for some reason you don't want to unmute and ask in real time, or maybe you don't have a mic at your computer, feel free to also enter questions in the QA chat or in the normal chat function at this point. We just want to make sure you're taken care of. About 60 more seconds. Looks like Sarah Brown has a question. What is the approval app about? What is the approval app about?
I think Leona can take this. That's the approvals that get sent to Teams when you have automated flows, and you can actually pull those out of Teams and show these on the dashboards.
Yes, yeah. In essence, it is the approvals app that, again, either those are manually created or if you have any Power Automate approvals actions, so there is specifically approvals in Power Automate flows. So if you ever make those manually or do that, it's a way to surface those approvals into the SharePoint page.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and great question, Sarah. Angelica, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thanks. We appreciate it. Give about 10 more seconds, see if anyone else has any additional questions. Let me check the QA really quick just to confirm. All right, guys. Well, we appreciate you spending time with us this Thursday, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Keep an eye out for the email coming your way. All right. Thank you, guys.